The purpose of this screencast video lecture is to introduce our discussion of consideration doctrine. This second part focuses on distinguishing enforceable bargains from unenforceable gift promises, and on understanding the function of formal doctrinal requirements like consideration. Recall the facts of our enigmatic principal case, Kirksey against Kirksey. Here are the facts in one sentence. The Supreme Court of Alabama refuses to enforce a brother-in-law's promise to let Antiloco have a place to raise her family because the promise was a mere gratuity and thus unsupported by consideration. I'll give you a little more detail. Brother-in-law Isaac advises Antiloco to obtain her preference and sell the land she's now living on. He then says, "If you will come down and see me, I will let you have a place to raise your family. I feel like I want you and the children to do well." Antiloco abandons her land. Everything goes well for 2 years. Then Isaac sends her to a shack in the woods. And after that, he evicts her altogether. The judge writing the opinion would find consideration, based on a benefit or detriment theory of consideration. But the other two judges think it was a gratuitous promise and thus not supported by consideration. They conclude it's a mere gratuity. You might recall the discussion of a mere volunteer in Bailey against West. Supposing that Isaac's promise was a gift, how do you make a gift enforceable? Is a promise enough? No. Because of the lack of consideration, a promise to make a gift is not enforceable. To be enforceable, a gift must be completed by actual delivery. In this case, Antiloco would need a deed to the land. To see another side of this distinction between bargains and gifts, let's consider the hypothetical involving Williston's tramp. Why is Williston's offer of the overcoat merely a conditional gift? Please pause the video now to think about this question. Jot down your answer. Were you able to explain why it's a conditional gift? The answer is that Williston did not seek the tramp's walk to the store in exchange for the promised overcoat. Think of Section 71. How shall we determine, though, whether a statement requests consideration or instead expresses a condition on a gratuitous promise? Williston suggests that an aid will be to decide whether the happening of the condition will be a benefit to the promisor. In exchanges, we seek benefits. If it's a condition for a gift, the promisor probably doesn't care about the condition itself. Let's turn to In re Green. Here again, let me give you the facts in a sentence. A federal district court judge in New York refuses to enforce a now bankrupt man's promises to pay significant sums of money to his former mistress, because the judge concludes that the mistress gave nothing in exchange. Here's a bit more detail. The case involves a contract under seal between Green the bankrupt and Lila Trudell, his former mistress. Green promised to pay $1,000 a month for their joint lives, a $100,000 insurance policy on his life, and a penalty of $100,000 if he fails to pay the premiums on the insurance policy. Finally, he promised to pay rent for 4 years on an apartment. Trudell files a claim against the estate of the bankrupt Green. A trustee now manages the available funds. Be aware that trustees in bankruptcy are as reluctant to pay questionable claims as are executors of estates. Remember our discussion in Hamer against Sidway. Trudell cites 4 distinct types of consideration in her argument: the recited consideration of $1, the surrender of all claims, a release from tax liability, and the recitation of other good and valuable consideration. How best can we argue that neither 1, nor 3, nor 4 supply consideration for Green's promises? Please pause the video now to think about this question. Jot down your answers for each category. Were you able to explain why none of these supplies consideration for Green's promises? First, consider the recited consideration of $1. This trivial sum, which may or may not have been paid, is merely a sham, an effort to dress up a gift as an exchange. Unless the dollar bill is an extremely rare collector's item, no court will believe that the parties were genuinely making a bargain to trade $1 for $100,000. Second, what about the release from tax liability? The simple answer here is that Green had no liability to release. He didn't owe any taxes and had no legal obligation to pay any. Finally, think about the recital of other good and valuable consideration. As the court colorfully observes, the parties may shout consideration to the housetops. But to be a contract, we have to have evidence of some real bargain. An important theme of the court's analysis here is that we need to privilege substance over form. This principle influences many other decisions in contracts and in other areas of law as well. A great example is tax shelters. IRS rules focus on the economic substance of a transaction rather than the form of the transaction. But forms and formality are still potentially important for understanding the legal enforcement of promises. As the textbook notes, Lon Fuller has suggested that consideration serves four main functions. Here are Fuller's four functions of form. The first is an evidentiary function. We might think of this as involving an inquiry into whether it was a real promise, whether the parties actually made it. The second is a cautionary function. Here we might think of it as asking whether the promise is a serious one, whether the parties really meant to make an enforceable promise. The third category of deterrent function is very difficult to distinguish from the cautionary function. And then finally, the channeling function asks really whether the promise is an intentional one, whether the parties chose to make it enforceable. Let's try to apply these criteria to In re Green. How would these goals lead you to decide the Green case? Well, let's start with evidentiary. There's really no doubt that an agreement was reached here. It's a written contract under seal. We have good evidence of an agreement. How about the cautionary function? Well, again, we have a written document with highly specific terms. It certainly wasn't offhand, and it strikes you as a very serious undertaking. So it seems as though the cautionary function is also satisfied. Let's skip deterrent function and focus on channeling function. The channeling function seems satisfied as well. The parties themselves chose a very formal, sealed written document, and the adoption of these legal formalities suggests a conscious effort to make promises binding. Thus, they have chosen the legally enforceable channel, and the channeling function seems to be satisfied. If Fuller's theory explains the functional reasons that we impose a consideration requirement, then we're left with a puzzle. Why didn't the court enforce Green's promises? Surely there ought to be enough doctrinal flexibility to find consideration, even here, if a court wished to enforce. I think there are at least two potential explanations. First, it may be that courts adopted the consideration rule to serve these functions of formality, but the bargain theory happens to be somewhat under-inclusive. It excludes even seriously intended gift promises from enforcement. As we'll see very soon, the promissory estoppel doctrine modestly expands enforcement for some promises made without consideration. But the bargain theory rules out enforcement under consideration doctrine for this promise. Another possibility is that the court may be disinclined to protect Lila Trudell from Green's default on these promises. Notice that the court refers to illicit intercourse and illicit cohabitation repeatedly. The court says of Trudel that she lived in adultery and the claimant knew it. She was well over 30 years of age, a woman, and so on. For me, these passages have echoes of Bill Clinton's comment about that woman, referring to Monica Lewinsky. These statements and the subtle digs they involve show that the court disapproves of the Trudel-Green relationship. We might call this overriding policy concern the strumpet factor. In particular, the judge does not wish to reward Lila Trudel at the expense of other, more legitimate commercial creditors. You get the impression that the judge believes that she's already gotten more than she deserves. After all, she's well over 30 and knew that Green was married. But notice that not just undesirable, but also completely legitimate gift promises are not enforced under the consideration doctrine. So the puzzle of seriously intended gifts remains. If you really want to make a promise to make a gift, consideration doctrine declines to enforce. Is this an unduly narrow view of the functions of contract law? Recall that Green memorialized his promises to Trudel in a sealed contract. As the textbook explains, the seal would at one time have been sufficient to ensure enforcement, even of gift promises like Green's. And surely most gift promises are not morally objectionable in any way. Richard Posner has argued that the elimination of the seal is a mysterious development from the standpoint of efficiency. We might ask whether it would perhaps make sense to revive the seal. Or should we enact legislation to create a new formality with which parties can create binding gratuitous promises? Maybe not. The seal itself developed into a trap for the unwary. And other legal devices exist for making future gifts. The trust, for example. But it's still somewhat puzzling that even if you really, really, really want to make a binding gratuitous promise, courts use consideration doctrine to avoid enforcement of gift promises. They appear to prefer to focus contract law on what is viewed as its principal objective, to facilitate mutually beneficial exchanges. As we will see, some enforcement is available through promissory estoppel doctrine. For example, there's a special rule for charitable subscriptions. But the influence of the bargain requirement makes these pockets of enforcement the exception rather than the rule. Thanks for listening.